I see my guest here. Let's go to him. We are joined with the man himself, Warwick Powell. How you doing, Warwick? You doing okay today?
I'm okay. It's very warm where I am at the moment. It's in
Is
the
it? Lucky
it is. It's
you.
warm and humid and rather awful actually. But there
You
you
call
go.
that awful? I'll tell you this. When I was in Jakarta, it was hot every day and I loved it. It was like 90 degrees every day. And I get here and it's wet, chilly. I have the heater on. I haven't had to have, the heater on. I haven't had a heater on in like 6 months. Um, yeah,
Oh,
it's a little bit weird. You get so
there's no
accustomed to
winning
like,
wherever you are. There's no winning wherever you are. There's
I
always
love Jakarta's temperature personally, and I love Malaysia's temperature.
yeah.
It's it's funny. The Malaysians, they would have an air conditioner blasting anywhere that you go in. It's like, dude, why is it so cold in here? There's like a tile outside. I was like, yeah, but you know, it's not that hot. It's funny how like the climate, like as I was telling them in the States, it gets cold and it gets hot. Like we have seasons.
Yeah.
And there it just stays hot constantly.
Just
Same
hot.
thing in Jakarta, it just stays hot constantly. So but just for the audience to know, Warwick Powell, he's adjunct professor, Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Networks Group of Companies, and president of Data Integrity and Supply Chain Association. You can also check Warwick on his Substack. He has a fantastic Substack. He writes, prolific writer. He writes all the time. I have been, as I pointed out, illuminated by various articles that you have written, and I love to cover those articles when they come out. So thank you for joining me, man. I got the timing wrong. It is, we fell an hour back in the States. So we're starting an hour early, technically, from the standpoint of the United States. It's okay. I'll work it out next time around. But I didn't want
where
to
I'm
delay.
where I'm at in Brisbane on the east coast of Australia, we don't have daylight saving ever, which means our time doesn't change, but Sydney and Melbourne go ahead by 1 hour. So it really messes everyone around, including people who live in Brisbane, because for the first month or month and a half of summer, everybody's confused. And if you live on the border of the states, between New South Wales and Queensland, and you live on one side and work on the other, or the children go to school on one side or have activities on the other, it's total mayhem. So the fact that you and I happen to have managed to coincide, I think, is a little bit of a miracle in itself.
Well, my uncle sent me a text. He says, hey, just be aware, we're falling back. It was like, we're falling back, just be aware. And so when I hit all of my guests, I told my guests, usually on the radio show, it always screws up on those days. It never fails. It screws up. Either a guest is missing, a guest comes in like an hour earlier, hour late. Yep. But no, for this one, I was aware. So I was trying to give everybody a heads up. I'm trying to do the calculations myself.
But we did okay. We did okay. Yeah.
But I thank you for joining me, though. I really do appreciate it. You wrote 2 articles. Now, I just saw the first one earlier today. You wrote Tortoise and the Hare. But the one I want to hit first before I get into the Tortoise and the Hare has to do with you pointing out that this is America's Suez moment. And just to give the audience context, Xi Jinping and Trump meet in Busan. Now, Trump had all sorts of bellicosity. There was all sorts of, I don't even know if I'm going to meet Xi Jinping. I don't even know if I'm going to talk to him. Who knows? Who knows? Maybe I won't. Maybe I will. All of this bellicosity that was coming out of Trump. All for 1 hour and 40 minutes for Trump to completely capitulate. And when I say capitulate, I mean capitulate. It was the U.S. that initiated the trade war, not China. It was the U.S. that ratcheted up demands. It was the U.S. that decided to go after boats and shipping and tariffs on fentanyl. We did all of this stuff. And what you ended up with was effectively a climb down within the course of an hour and 40 minutes. What do you say? Tacos. I think Carl John made the point of saying, hey, man, it's not just on Tuesdays I like tacos. I also like tacos on Thursdays. Making the point that Trump always capitulates, what is it, overall or in the end, or chickens out. Trump always chickens out. And in this case, he chickened out. You call this, though, a Suez Canal moment. Break that down for us. Why are you calling it the Suez Canal moment?
The Suez Canal incident in the 50s was when the British, the last remnants of the British Empire, sought to take charge over the Suez Canal. But under pressure from the Americans and under threat from the Soviets, they backed off. So in a sense, it was the sort of moment that drew an end to the sort of slow unwinding of the British Empire. It was the moment where the UK or the British Empire had to concede that it couldn't act unilaterally and that it was forced to back down. So from a historical perspective, that incident, that moment, was quite symbolic of the end of a couple of centuries of British Empire dominance around the world. And, you know, you could say that it was, in some respects, the passing of the baton to the United States. Now, I don't think we're seeing any baton passing, as I think we've discussed before at the moment. That's not the nature of the evolutions of the global system that we're witnessing, in my view. But I think that from the point of view of the 35 years of unipolar dominance by the United States, the 70-odd years or so of Pax Americana, those elements of what have been, you know, by and large, an American-dominated 3/4 of a century, that's come to an end. Now, that's not to say, again, as we've discussed before, that the United States has somehow collapsed into a screaming heap. It hasn't. It's a big country. It's a big economy. It has a lot of talented and skilled people. It has its own troubles, like every other place does. But it certainly no longer can command the unilateral, unquestioned, unbridled position of unipolar hegemon as it once did. And the Busan blink, as I called it, epitomized that.
Yeah, you call it the sunset of the unipolar moment. That this was. It's funny. I always find there are multiple canaries in the coal mine. I mean, one, I thought Ukraine was one. This idea that the U.S. could necessarily use its economic might and military might to effectively overwhelm Russia in and of itself, meaning all of the powers of NATO with the U.S. backing it, couldn't necessarily change the context of what was taking place on the ground. I thought that was a huge deal and a huge moment that people should have been aware of, but not necessarily. And then Trump comes in and starts trade war and is not able to bully his way economically. So in an economic sense and in the military sense, this unipolarity wasn't shown itself, meaning it wasn't, it was unfounded. Its capabilities was corralled, or at the very least limited. And I think, as you point out, the Busan blink was indeed the sunset of the unipolar moment in the economic sense of the term. What was accomplished? What took place in Busan in South Korea? What was the terms that eventually unfolded in that meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump?
Look, I think we've just got to put it all into the context of like the last 9 months or so to understand what happened.
Please.
After President Trump took office again, he initiated a number of measures, punitive measures against China, initially in the name of trying to force China to do more in relation to the fentanyl question. And under a number of other provisions, he signed off on some executive powers and introduced assorted tariffs. Come 2nd of April, President Trump announced with great fanfare a whole swathe of tariffs, so-called reciprocal tariffs, on what he called Liberation Day across every national economy in the world. Not long after that announcement was made, it became quite clear that the formula that was used to decide the relevant tariffs for each of these national economies was largely plucked out of thin air, and it had no bearing on the actual trade balance between the United States and each of these countries. So immediately it made a lie of the claim that these were reciprocal tariffs. Often in cases where the United States actually enjoyed a trade surplus, tariffs were imposed anyway. So Australia was a great case in point, where Australian products was hit with a 10% tariff, even though the United States enjoys a trade surplus with Australia. So there was a whole bunch of nonsense already. China pushed back. So very significant tariffs were levied on China. China reciprocated with tariffs in kind. This went on for a few rounds as the tariffs were ratcheted up. As the United States would ratchet them up, China would respond in kind. And ultimately, it reached a point where I think the respective tariff rates applied on both sides had gone well over 100%. They were higher in terms of the tariffs that were applied on Chinese products because Trump began imposing tariffs far earlier than the 2nd of April. But basically, tariffs had gone over 100%, at which point the Chinese just said, look, if you want to keep pushing them up, we're not going to bother anymore because it's reached a point where, in effect, any additional increment of tariff increase is going to make zero difference to what is in effect the destruction of trading relationships between the two economies. So very rapidly after that, meetings were held between the China side and American side, concluding that they would agree to a temporary cessation of hostilities, wind arrangements back to where they were at literally prior to the announcement of the Liberation Day tariffs, so as to enable talks to proceed. A number of talks were then entered into, the last of which was in Madrid. The agreements or the understandings out of Madrid was really to lay the groundwork for the final round of discussions with a view of there being some kind of a summit between Presidents Xi and Trump. Now, not long after Madrid, the meetings in Madrid arrived at these understandings, and some of those included neither side doing anything to provoke each other. The United States moved forward with a couple of additional measures. One was the so-called 50% measures, which in effect broadened the number of Chinese companies caught in the American blacklists from about 1,400 companies to 20,000 companies. And the United States also released a report and a finding concerning the shipbuilding industry, which recommended and subsequently was to be adopted a response which was to levy an additional set of fees on all ships that would dock in American ports, the ships that were made in China, even if they weren't owned by Chinese interests or flying Chinese flags. So long as they were made in China, those ships would be levied with additional fees. Now, China saw all of this as incredibly provocative and also contrary to the understandings that were reached in Madrid. And the response to all of that was the announcements of the rare earth and other materials export regulations, the licensing regulations on the 9th of October. After that, the United States went into an absolute apoplectic fit. Clearly, this particular tranche of rare earths went straight to the heart of the military-industrial complex. Bear in mind that China had already introduced a number of export license regulations on rare earths earlier, in the last 9 months. So we've had a series of escalations. China matched the escalations. Eventually, China responded. Then we had the hurried reaction to the rare earths licensing situation, which saw meetings held in Kuala Lumpur between the two sides that ultimately arrived at what was then described as a framework. And the framework essentially was all the key terms of the agreement that was signed off at the leaders' summit. So the key terms, in effect, saw the winding back of all of the United States tariffs that they had imposed on Liberation Day, a winding back of half of the so-called fentanyl tariffs, the suspension of the 50% rule. So a whole bunch of those companies that were blacklisted were no longer blacklisted. And all of this was to extend for 12 months. In response, China would begin to purchase American soybeans again. Obviously something of significant political interest to the Trump administration and arguably of personal fiduciary interest to the Secretary of the Treasury, who announced to the world that he felt the pain of farmers because he himself owned soybean farms. So, as a soybean farming landlord, he could appreciate the pain that was happening in the sector. So China agreed to resume purchasing beans, and China also agreed to suspend the application of the export licensing regimes for those licenses that were announced on the 9th of October, not for anything prior, but for those that were announced on the 9th of October, so that they could be better studied and for the implementation to be fine-tuned and clarified. And that was also to be for a year. The glass half full way of looking at this from a US point of view really is that there has been a 12-month détente, a cessation of hostilities for 12 months. Whether any of this holds or not, I guess time will tell. Many people would say that the United States is incapable of coming to agreements on things. So, we'll see how long this particular set of arrangements lasts for. There's incredible political pressure domestically on Trump, both from the Democrats now, who are calling, the capitulation, but there's neocons on both sides of the fence who find this set of accommodations to be totally outrageous and really want to see America reinstigate an active and hostile posture towards China. None of that's happening. So Trump initiated a whole bunch of aggressive measures. They've all been walked back, and we are back at square one.
But to be clear, though, Trump didn't pull back because he wanted to. Trump pulled back because he had to.
Correct. So if Trump didn't have to, he wouldn't have. Right. As simple as that. Let's not forget that these measures are the centerpiece of Trump's economic doctrine. When Trump ran for office the first time and then this second time, he argued that the American economy had been hollowed out, that it had been deindustrialized, and that it had been taken advantage of by others.
Right.
This was evidenced by trade deficits in manufactures, and what he claimed was a destruction of the employment base of manufacturing towns and centers in America. Tariffs was the answer to all of this. We're going to impose tariffs. They were his favorite word. Tariffs would make America great again. They were going to be a big revenue generator. People would, countries around the world would be paying tariffs to the American government. Untrue, but anyway, that was the claim. And so we've actually seen the shelving of the centerpiece of President Trump's economic doctrine. Without this as the centerpiece, there is nothing that's coherent about the current economic policy framework. And you do have to wonder where this administration goes in terms of economic policy if it does not have tariffs as part of its principal set of tools. The other sort of thing to bear in mind about these tariffs is not only have there been the walking back in relation to China, but during the course of the last 6 months or so, there've been a myriad of exemptions made. So the headline number that's been applied to products from all sorts of countries is actually not really the headline number or not really the effective tariff rate, because there's a lot of products that are exempted. And the minute you start doing that, you sort of create a few different sort of unintended consequences. One is straight down the line regulatory arbitrage. Nimble economic actors, enterprises and entrepreneurs will look for advantage in the differences that exist between tariff rates. So that's the first thing, and they've got to be policed and all of this. So that becomes an administrative nightmare and a policing nightmare to administer these rules. The second thing it does is that it undermines the fundamental rationale of the tariffs in the first place. Let's not forget that it was to tackle trade deficits, right? To shift manufacturing back to America and shift it away from China, principally. If it couldn't shift it out of China to America, the second best outcome was that it would be shifted out of China to some other part of the world. Right. Now, if all of that was to happen, in theory, the rates of tariffs would have had to have been exceedingly high, so that the economic calculus favored relocating production facilities to North America. The tariff rates were never high enough to do any of that, number one. Number two, the differentials between the products of different countries is such that there is no incentives to to relocate out of China to other parts of the world. And we're starting to see reports, right, of companies that, in response to some of the sort of geopolitical dynamics and risks, sought to relocate production facilities from China to India. And they found it to be incredibly difficult. Workforce capability, training, reliable infrastructure, etc., was actually created a very difficult environment to just, pick up a factory in one place and move it to another. The other thing that I have seen some interesting reports on, and I'd need to verify this myself, but I saw some headlines and a report on CNBC a couple of hours ago, which talked about how the effective rate on products from India is actually now higher than the effective rate being levied on products from China. So the whole sort of architecture of this tariffs regime has just crumbled in this sort of geopolitical mess. And there's actually nothing good about this from a political perspective as far as the administration's concerned. If there is one little silver lining in all of this mess, and there's a few, and we can get into some of those, I guess, geopolitically later, but I think one of the interesting silver linings is that this will actually help the United States. The fact that President Trump's had to back off because the policies, had they continued in place, were actually contrary to the interests of many Americans and contrary to the interests of American household consumers, as well as enterprises that were buying intermediate goods. So this will actually be a better outcome economically for many Americans than otherwise.
So, just to be clear, for the rare earths, it's the extension of the rare earths that were removed, not the original, let's say, restrictions that were put on rare earths in the very beginning.
Correct. Well, there were some put in from memory in May or thereabouts. I don't believe that anything's been committed in relation to those at all. So this goes to dysprosium and a couple of others. And there were some introduced much earlier. So these are the licensing arrangements on germanium and gallium. So none of those have been part of this arrangement as well. In effect, those rare earth export licensing requirements are in place. On everything else, we're back to essentially the 1st of April.
Basically a stalemate.
Well, in a sense, except that, as you said, Trump was compelled to wind back. Had he not been compelled to wind back, he wouldn't have wound back. And so whilst the arrangements, in a sense, go back to what you'd call the status quo ante, the dynamics of political power globally is anything but status quo ante. I mean, this really showed the world that, firstly, China had the willingness to go toe-to-toe with the United States, which very few countries have done for a very long time.
Yes.
And secondly, China had stuck to its guns and achieved the outcome that it sought to achieve, which was the winding back of arrangements. Now, you'll notice that China has done this in a way that gave plenty of room to President Trump to not be entirely and explicitly humiliated in this process. In fact, it didn't push all the way for the abolition of all the tariffs and everything going back some years. It had a fairly contained set of demands, and that meant that President Trump is able to say that there are tariffs in place, and therefore he's achieved something because they weren't in place beforehand. I think that that's a clever way of, and I think ultimately also a responsible way of dealing with what is in effect a very challenging period for the United States, where its unbridled unipolar power has literally been stripped away. The last thing China would want is for an America that feels humiliated and angry, because that does not create the conditions for a longer-term peaceful settlement. And I touched on that in that piece a week or so ago, where I talked about the lessons of the Treaty of Versailles. And I think we saw precisely that mentality at work coming out of Busan.
Basically giving the U.S. capability of saving face, despite the fact that it ultimately failed in its objectives. No, I guess I can see that. I mean, the U.S. would not have done that to China. They would have tried to put a dagger in them. But yes, you're right. China seemed to have allowed them to save face in this. You pointed out that there were benefits. So I guess the key benefit is that ultimately Trump failed because the United States was effectively going to be the one paying for the sanctions. I mean, paying for the tariffs. Meaning, I saw some of the reports. It was like $1 trillion that we are paying the majority of, which effectively is increasing inflation and everything else in the United States, despite the fact Trump kept saying that it was foreigners that were paying for the tariffs. Didn't he know? I mean, wouldn't there have to have been people in the United States that would have known that A, these tariffs weren't high enough to bring the companies over, and B, it's Americans that are paying for the tariffs, so we're going to be the ones accepting and paying for it? Or you don't think they knew? You think they were just dumb?
Well, there were plenty of people who warned about this from day one, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that President Trump has been a long-term believer in tariffs, right? So he believes in tariffs as an article of faith. He's surrounded with some advisors who hold similar views. The fact that these views have been proven to be erroneous and were actually anticipated to be erroneous through the application of just some basic logic and thinking through how these things work, didn't mean that these people didn't have, in the first instance, what one might concede to be genuine or good faith beliefs in the merits and effectiveness of tariffs. They were just wrong.
Wow, fair enough. But that doesn't really have any effect on the tariffs that he's using elsewhere. For example, the tariffs on Russian oil, for example, the tariffs on, let's say, Europe, some Southeast Asian countries. I mean, those remain in effect.
They do. I understand that there's a court case coming up that will have something to say about some of those. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not the Supreme Court upholds the appeal against the president's use of executive powers or not. I'm certainly no expert in how the Supreme Court works, so all I can do is rely upon things that I read. And I think one of the interesting things will be to see whether or not the Supreme Court, the majority of whom have now been appointed by President Trump over the course of his previous term, will display, obvious partisan loyalties, or will they take on board the merits of the arguments that President Trump has really exceeded the authorities of executive powers to do what he's done, and that in fact the powers of taxation and tariffs, etc., properly reside with the Congress.
Yeah, we don't know. The Supreme Court can be a fickle mistress on stuff like this. He's already lost the previous cases, and the U.S. would have to pay back billions of dollars in tariffs. And God, man, it gets interesting. Like, can you sue for your grocery bill being higher as a result of the tariffs that Donald Trump put on, if they were indeed found to be illegal? All of that stuff becomes a question at that point.
Given the litigious culture in the United States, it wouldn't surprise me if a class action wasn't initiated around this, which would take the issue all the way into the midterms, where a whole bunch of arguments will be run about the extent to which tariffs did impact ultimately the grocery bills, etc. And it wouldn't surprise me if an entrepreneurial lawyer sought to do this.
I'm curious, what would the tariffs, well, I guess there are two questions. A, what would they have had to be to accomplish the objective that Donald Trump wanted, effectively to force manufacturing to come back to the United States? And two, would that have taken place in 3 years? Meaning they know that Trump is only going to be there for 3 years. Is that something that they just ride out? Or would they have tried to move in that short period of time? From my point of view, they would have never done that in 3 years. But I could be wrong.
You've got to sort of think through what's involved in setting up new production systems, right? What the costs of them are in terms of capital expenses,
Yeah.
you know, getting approvals for building factories, then connecting them up with electricity, et cetera, et cetera. These are not small undertakings, particularly if you're doing them at scale. So that's your first set of challenges, is that it just takes time and effort to do, and it's not easy or cheap. The second thing is that if somebody was inclined to do that, or a large number of firms were inclined to do that, it's likely that that would lead to upward price pressure on things related to the building of factories, because there would be increased demand for all the skills and materials that factories would demand. And that will have spillover effects onto the other parts of the economy, because the booming sector would draw resources away from the sectors that aren't booming, okay, and bid up prices in doing so. So that's your first thing. The second thing is that because it takes time and effort, it's a very difficult decision to make when there's so much uncertainty. If you don't know how long these provisions are actually going to be in place, it's very hard to make, you know, such a massive commitment to, and because there's risk involved, right? Which is that
Yeah.
it might take longer, it might be more expensive, and there might not ultimately be sufficient demand to warrant the capital investment, which means you're staring at a loss down the track. So there's a lot of big questions for enterprises to answer when they are thinking about building new factories. And I think that there are two big issues for, or probably three even, for the Trump agenda. One was getting the tariff rates high enough so that it was no longer competitive to manufacture offshore, and that would be offset by the increased costs of building factories onshore. Factor number one. Factor number two is this issue of the uncertainty and the time lag. Okay, so a lot of firms would be in two minds. You know, maybe this will go away. Maybe there's a midterms coming up. Maybe when the next presidential election comes and a new administration comes in, it'll change. So you've got those issues. But I think that there's another set of deeply troubling issues for reindustrialization, and that is that the state of American infrastructure, in many cases, is actually not up to the requirements of modern manufacturing. So the electricity distribution network is no longer of a standard that is necessary in many parts of the United States to support the kinds of industrialization that we're talking about. The telephony or digital transfer network is also not up to scratch in many cases, where you want to have high-powered 5G capabilities to enable you to operate an intensely robotic and automated production system, and to control that remotely using artificial intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of reasons why popping factories up out of the ground is actually a difficult and fraught decision for enterprises. And I think it was a little bit wishful from President Trump and his team's point of view that this would happen anyway, and they really misunderstood the challenges involved in practical terms, and the need ultimately, if the objective was a reindustrialization of America, there's also a need to get a workforce up to a point where it's actually capable of supporting industry. And when you take all of those factors into account, I doubt that the policy was ever going to work. And because it was barely touching on one of the factors, which was price differentials, but it never addressed any of the other issues, which was uncertainty, poor infrastructure quality, et cetera, et cetera.
Do you think the objective itself was worthy though? Meaning, like,
Look, I
even if,
understand it. I'm not sure
yeah,
that it is even viable, right? Right. But because in some respects, it's the politics of nostalgia which is speaking here, which is maybe we can somehow recreate the sort of social and economic conditions of the 1950s.
right.
But but the real challenge is actually looking forward. What are the jobs of the future? Not how do we get the jobs of the past back? And they're two very different questions. And I think the politics of the Trump administration was very much leaning towards how do we get the jobs we've lost back, as opposed to how do we create the jobs of the future and ensure that the workforce has the skills that are needed for those jobs, and ensure that the institutional arrangements deliver a fair outcome to the people who are working in these industries. Now, I don't think any of those questions have actually really been asked. And until the United States thinks a lot more about the jobs of the future, as opposed to pining over the lost jobs of the past, it's going to find the rejuvenation of high-valued industrial activity quite difficult. See, the United States over 50 years has evolved from one where manufacturing, in many parts manual to start with and slowly but surely mechanized, was an important part of the economic system, to one that is a much smaller proportion of the economy as a whole.
Right.
The services sector has grown significantly, some of which in the finance and insurance and real estate industry arguably aren't particularly value adding, other than for a very small proportion of people. But there's a lot of other services work that are basically the mainstay of the American economy these days. Now, what are you going to do? You've got to train people off those services jobs into other kinds of jobs. That again, it's not just a click of the finger that these things happen. You got to build the educational institutions and training institutions that actually enable you to do that. And that means actually a commitment to things like science, technology, engineering, etc., etc. Essentially university education and also research and development. But those activities are actually being stripped bare at the moment.
Yeah, we're not doing that. I mean, we're even cutting NASA, for God's sake. And this idea of free college and those type of things that would incentivize, we're not doing it. It's just not part of the way we function. No. I think the issue is more so like service jobs don't pay anything. And so if you have a huge number of people working at McDonald's, Burger King, temp jobs, YouTube, like these kind of gig positions, these jobs are unreliable, unstable. And if you're looking at the American economy, for example, you have the overwhelming majority of the people, I think it's like 70%, don't have $500 in case of an emergency. That is unsustainable. But conversely, if you ask people, would you like to work in a factory? They would say no. But if you ask them, do you want more factories? They would say yes. It's very bizarre.
Yeah.
I don't know how to fix that issue. And I guess they don't either at this point.
No, and that's part of the challenge of where things are at, I think, in America, which is, look, I get the sort of politics of all of this. I understand the social and cultural anxieties that come with all of this, particularly when people do look wistfully back at a time where, at least in their imaginations, things were simpler and better.
Yes.
Today, they aren't that simple for many people. They're certainly not better for many people. And they yearn for a time when, for them, it was, even if it was only in their imaginations. Because frankly, I think for a lot of working people in America, the 1950s was hardly anything to write home about. I mean, they weren't actually particularly great times either. And, if you were black, uneducated, I think the 1950s, and the further south you went, the less desirable the experience of America was. So a lot of this is, of course, a product of the political imagination, how we imagine a better time in the past. And the politics of MAGA and Trump have very much been about bringing back something that's been lost, hence the last day in MAGA, making America great again. It really does lean very heavily on this nostalgic imagination, even if a lot of it's untrue.
Is it true that much of the economy is... So I was looking at a graph that was pointing out elements of our society and the economy. Most of it seemed to be in a recession, with the exception of, let's say, things like AI, this kind of AI bubble that was pulling the United States out of recession territory. Is that true, that artificial intelligence is effectively the thing that the U.S. economy is leaning on, and if it wasn't for that, we'd effectively be in a recession?
Yeah, pretty much. And consequently, you also see a real patchwork quilt across the country, right, of parts of the country that in aggregate terms are doing okay, plenty of money flowing around, and then in other parts where it's simply not. And the boom in AI and data centers and things like that is clearly concentrating activity in certain parts of the United States. It's certainly driving a lot of wealth creation, particularly in stock valuations, but it's not helping other parts of the country. And this patchwork that you describe, I saw a map as well of the United States broken down into its states, where you could see that there was something like the report estimated about 23 of the states, so almost half, already in recession, and about another 10 or 15 or so are essentially treading water, not in recession, but certainly not in growth territory. So you're probably looking at about a quarter of the states in the United States that are currently in growth territory, and of those, maybe 5 or 6 are seriously experiencing the benefits of the AI boom.
But if this is stock market evaluation, not necessarily part of the real economy, how this always confuses me. Money in the stock market doesn't seem to be a factor of the real economy, or is it? Am I getting something wrong?
No, well, I mean, it's basically exchange value being traded up, and until owners of stocks convert those stocks into cash or leverage their stock holdings to borrow, very little rubber hits the road, right? So that's really the only way in which stock valuations cause money to begin circulating in the economy again, or in the real economy. It's when people leverage or cash out and take that money and spend it. Otherwise, it really is just money chasing fictitious capital and driving the money unit value of those stocks up. But it's not really doing anything for anyone in ordinary mainstream America. Main Street really doesn't see much of any of this stuff. Wall Street does very, very well, but Main Street doesn't.
Is this a bubble in the real sense, in the sense of the .com bubble? I was a software engineer. I was a software engineer for like a decade. And I remember when I first got into the career, my company, it was at this cusp of the .com bubble, where my company remembered when they used to get like $1 million for a project, and that money had dropped from like $1 million to 100,000 for the exact same project. And of course, it was going even less because you had WYSIWYGs that would effectively build many of the software systems on behalf, meaning you had so many tools at a certain point, but you didn't really need these huge companies to do this stuff. And so the amount that the company would make made less and less. Is that what we're looking at with AI? And the reason why I'm asking this, you wrote this article, the secondary article, The Tortoise and the Hare AI. And if I can pull it up, there we are. The Tortoise and the Hare AI in AI. And your point is the US has jumped off to a huge lead in AI, but it's not going to keep that lead. And there are various reasons that are pushing against it being able to maintain the pace and the lead, especially against countries like China that seems to have an infrastructure and an industrial base that is more geared towards, let's say, the construction, creation, maintenance, etc., of AI technologies. Go into that for me, because if you're right, then all of the money that's being dumped into AI is going to end up in a bubble that pops the moment that China, takes off the gloves.
Well, it might pop for other reasons as well, which is shortage of system liquidity, and if a lot of the drivers of the stock valuations are based on people borrowing money to buy stocks, then
exactly
it is possible that that they're going to need to pay that back at some point, and that's going to cause possibly a run on stock. So there's lots of things that will bring the bubble to an end. But that article is one that I guess I put together over the last few weeks, but all these other events kept overtaking my window of opportunity to just finish that article and also publish it. So I thought eventually, sometime late yesterday, I put in a few extra hours and really just tidied it up to get it out the door, because I thought it was important. Not so much in the geopolitics of things per se, though obviously people will grab onto it in geopolitical terms, but to really understand that AI and the question of AI competitiveness, if you will, is really a systemic or an ecosystem question as opposed to one simply about who's got the best semiconductors. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that the United States continues to have the most energy efficient semiconductors around. And those particular, or there's a bunch of those particular chips have been prohibited from being exported to China. So that's where the United States advantage has been, and it has been able to roll those chips out into the data centers and really fast track the development of the early days and early versions of OpenAI and related LLM, large language model projects. So that's what I mean by the hair. It really got out the gates incredibly fast with wind in its tails, which came from having access to some of the best chips around. But it is an ecosystem question. So the chips are ultimately manufactured using a bunch of raw materials. The question is where do those raw materials come from? And can the United States own chip makers have access to those raw materials in cost competitive terms? As we know, many of the raw materials, including rare earths, come from China. And so China itself obviously has a significant capacity to govern the upstream components of an industry and ultimately contribute to the downstream development of the chip manufacturing sector in China, which it has been behind in. The second thing you've got to understand is, even if you've got the most efficient chips, if your energy costs are really high compared to someone else, your chip efficiency advantage may be offset by your energy cost disadvantage. So one cancels the other out. And I think we have a situation where the United States efficiency advantage in terms of the chips is cancelled out by and large by its electricity cost disadvantage relative to China. So in many regards, the terrain has been leveled. The third thing we get is that China has, in the face of hardware constraints, developed software hardware optimization using clever algorithms and design configurations. So they're able to squeeze more performance out of inferior chips for a given amount of energy input than a comparable setup in the United States. So ultimately, from an energy to output point of view, China is actually delivering a slightly more competitive proposition. Add to that the centrality of Chinese open source AI models. So you've got cost advantage evidenced in lower token prices for Chinese AI models, open source AI models themselves, which people can download and run and develop on top of. That advantage, that couplet, is actually seeing the growth in the download of Chinese AI models to a point where in the last month and a half, those cumulative downloads have surpassed the cumulative downloads of American AI models. Okay, so Chinese AI models have now become, in effect, more popular. They're cheaper in terms of performance and to run. And the last thing we can add on to this little story is the emergence, as a result of all these factors I've discussed, and what I call AI in a box, which is the ability to deliver AI solutions in a containerized format with its own independent power supplies and communications arrays that in effect enables China to sell complete full stack AI solutions into the developing world at incredibly low cost. And that enables those parts of the world to participate in AI in a sovereign environment. Now, all of this ultimately leads to a couple of important conclusions. One is that China, in effect, by making these ecosystems available to all sorts of people around the world, are going to create a very large ecosystem of people who are accustomed to developing solutions on these platforms and ultimately become de facto champions of these platforms. That's the first thing that's happening. The second thing is that you end up, once you've got the software piece, developers comfortable developing within a particular software environment, you've got the fit for purpose hardware piece. So you've now got a hardware solution that comes in behind, and it's that package deal that really is what ultimately sells the story, not whether or not you've got the most efficient chips. And China has had to make the most of the fact that it's had inferior chips, but superior electricity, superior enforced optimization. They've had to do it. And ultimately, as a result of all of that, are delivering like for like a much cheaper AI alternative than what's currently available out of the United States. None of that augurs well for high capex systems, which is what the US AI industry is. Don't be surprised if the AI industry in the United States will seek more and more favors from government, more and more protections from government, so as to reduce the extent to which Chinese AI functions as a competitor. And that's despite the fact that the US continues to have the better position when it comes to these AI semiconductors.
Well, that also gets into the whole thing of making it open source, where you've effectively, it's kind of like Google Docs versus Microsoft, where the moment that you make Google Docs open source, anybody can use it. Anybody can use it for free. So why do I need to pay money in order to get Word when I have Docs?
I'll give you an example. So some of your viewers might be familiar with the world of blockchains and distributed ledgers. So when the Ethereum blockchain network came live in July 2015, and with it the Solidity programming language, thousands of developers around the world ultimately learned how to program in Solidity. No one paid them, but they all did it because there was an environment where they could deploy their applications, smart contracts, and do things, on the world computer. And we now have an incredibly huge and vibrant software development ecosystem globally. Look, I haven't checked the numbers for quite some time, but there are tens of thousands of, possibly hundreds of thousands of Solidity developers working on all sorts of Ethereum virtual machine compatible blockchains. And in some ways, what's happening out of China with things like the Quen 2.5 and the Quen 3.0 models, which is what Alibaba's released, we're going to see the same thing happen. There will be a large global cohort of software developers and applications developers who will become accustomed to working within this particular applications environment. Right. And once you've got that, well, the sort of operating system, in a sense, just comes with it.
Yeah. This was the same thing with like C#, Microsoft products. You had to pay a huge amount of money in order to use it. Many companies did, but other people use PHP as some of the other systems that were effectively free to use. No, I totally get it. Yeah. I guess my thing is, if all of this money is leveraged into the stock market on the issue for AI, especially in the context of American companies, and China is able to, if not dominate, let's say take a huge market share associated with it, what does it do to the stock market for all of this money that has been leveraged in the US markets? Or does it do nothing? I mean, am I thinking of this wrong? I'm thinking of this in the context of, if this is indeed a bubble, that bubble pops. As you point out, it may pop just for other reasons, but there also seems to be a huge amount of pressure associated with the way China is releasing its AI products and the success of those products.
Look, I think that it is a big bubble, and it will pop, and and when it does, there will be a lot of paper wealth destroyed. Again, if there's an upside in the popping of this particular bubble, it's this. Almost all of that wealth is held by a very small proportion of Americans. And, some 93% of stock market value is actually held by the top 10% of Americans. Right. Half of that's held by 1% of Americans. So the rises and falls of stock valuations obviously affects everybody who owns stocks, right? But in the scheme of things, it will disproportionately affect wealthy people. There's very few people on Struggle Street who are in the bottom 50% of income, who have barely $500 in the bank account for a rainy day, who live paycheck to paycheck usually. There'll be very, very few of those people who own stocks. And, so the impairment of paper value, if you will, is hardly going to directly affect their lives. But it will certainly send shockwaves through the financial markets, and it will send shockwaves, I think, through the AI industry, because it will cause a whole lot of rethinking around the business models and the risks that investors are willing to take on all sorts of things associated with the ecosystem, whether it's particular applications or new models or enterprises that are trying to leverage some AI capability to do X, Y, and Z. The idea of OpenAI launching an AI-enabled video sharing app, social app, is that really going to be a viable use of AI computational power and the cost of the infrastructure that goes with it? Is an adults-only AI-based competitor to OnlyFans going to be financially viable?
Oh, what? An AI-based OnlyFans? Oh, well, you only have artificial intelligence.
Sam Altman announced a couple of weeks ago that they are going to release an adults or an age-regulated AI, where things that you can't have on a totally non-age specific environment can operate. And and all I can think of is essentially porn, gambling, and all the usual vices, right? So
it's like slap me on the ass, and it's an AI model slapping a guy on the ass.
And so look, I don't know what they've got in mind, but if that's where 2 years ago, 3 years ago, the hype was all about artificial general intelligence. We're within a hair's breadth of emulating God's greatest creation, right? That was the idea. And now we're basically left to gambling, porn, and video sharing. Look, I saw a very interesting article, by the way, in Harvard Business Review, which I linked to in that essay, actually, which talks about American enterprises implementing Chinese AI models to do what they want to do, what they need to do for commercial applications. This is not going to sustain in a political environment where so much political capital as well as money capital has been invested in AI as the next frontier of American dominance. If American businesses are actually using AI by downloading and running Chinese models and then building on top of them, what that really means is that they're not paying for American AI models, right? And how's the American body politic going to react to that? How are the folk inside the Beltway going to react?
That's also a recession, correct? If we're living off AI, the bubble burst.
Well, I saw also, there will be a contraction, right? Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent actually admitted today on some interviews or overnight that there are some sectors of the American economy that are already in recessionary conditions. I think he hinted that the housing industry was in one already and blamed sustained high interest rates, right? But
of course.
But put aside the politics of it, that from a simple description of fact point of view, you've got the Treasury Secretary now saying, well, some parts of the American economy are in recession, and and it's not going to get better if there's an AI bubble in the short term. In the medium term, what you would hope is that with the popping of the bubble, the resources that might have been sucked into AI unproductively would then be available for other things which may be more productive economically or socially.
One last question, and this has to do with the sanctions that Donald Trump just passed on Russia, where he went after two of the main oil companies. India seems to be pulling back on the use of Russian energy, even though they have been pretty clear, look, we're not stopping using Russian energy, even though the companies themselves seem to be trying to find a way to get around the sanctions. Is this, from your point of view, what effect is this going to have on the cost of energy that either we pay in the United States or just energy in general from the standpoint of the world market, since energy is usually accrued by world costs, not individual costs of nations?
APEC's made some decisions in the last 24 hours concerning its production outputs over the next few months. I actually can't remember what that was. I skimmed over it a few hours ago, but I think that there is the downside risk for the United States is that this will lead to an increase in the cost of fuel domestically. I'm not across the detail, to be honest with you, to really give a considered view on it, but it's likely, from what I have seen, that there will be some short-term, let's call it a period of administrative adjustment, and then it'll be back to business as usual again. There are a couple of private Indian oil refineries that also have got strong business links to the United States, and they'll be a little bit mindful of being caught up in too much of this. But I can't imagine the state-owned refineries in India being particularly perturbed, and they will find ways around this quite quickly. Let's not forget that President Putin, I think, is visiting India in the next month or so, and these issues, I doubt, will be unresolved issues that will, be something of a cloud over that visit. I think quite the reverse. I wouldn't be. I mean, there are some other pressures that the United States is putting on India too, right? Which is to in effect pull out of the Kandahar port, which is the big project going through Iran, and they've given them a 6-month window to essentially stop using it. Is India going to hold its ground on a lot of these issues? I know that there's a lot of people who have quite a negative view, I guess, about India, particularly its dependability as a pillar of the global South.
And BRICS,
and BRICS, but so far in their own way, and India does have its own style about the way it navigates and engages in diplomacy, and sometimes it involves not turning up to things, which has been recently the case. So far, it's actually held its ground more than what I think many people would have anticipated it to have done. It continues to buy Russian oil. It continues to collaborate with Russia on military hardware, and so I wouldn't write India off as far as its ability and its willingness to actually put its foot down if it gets pushed too hard. It's got a bit of work to do, I think, to strengthen its position so that it can do that with confidence. And of course, to do that, it will need to come to some more robust agreements with China, particularly on the economic front, so that those relationships can help India buffer any of the adverse effects in the short term of the US putting more pressure on it, right? So India will need to, I think carefully about how it prepares the groundwork over the next 6 months for it to be able to be in a better position to say no.
Warwick, you are awesome. I love your breakdowns. I love your articles. I'm going to put both articles at the bottom of the video after I cut the video. Thank you for this, man. Always appreciated. Warwick Powell. He's adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Networks Group of Companies, president of Data Integrity and Supply Chains Associations. You can find his writing on Substack under his name, Warwick Powell. Warwick, you have a fantastic rest of your night, man. Thank you for this. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Good to see you again, Jamal.
Absolutely. Be